Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about economics and economic reasoning. We're going to start off with a quote from Alfred Marshall, who is a famous economist, who says, "In my vacations, I visited the poorest quarters of several cities and walked through one street after another, looking at the faces of the poorest people. Next, I resolved to make as thorough a study as I could of political economy." A couple things I want to take out from this quote. One is that economics is going to be a social science, like psychology, like sociology. We're studying people and how people react to different economic environments, how people make decisions. We're going to observe and look at the behavior of people. Also want to point out that sometimes economics can get a reputation as being cold, or people studying economics in order to achieve financial gain, and that's all they care about, or this type of thought I've seen in the study of economics, or when economics is thought of or talked about. And I just want to point out that economics is going to be a tool just like any other tool, just like talking, just like rhetoric has the same type of negative connotation sometimes. Rhetoric just means expressing ideas and talking, and the expression of ideas is of course a good thing, although it can be used to do bad things as well. So it's going to be a tool that will be used. And note that most of the people that really have thought deeply about this tool and have had the biggest influence and have had the biggest impact and types of theories that have been turned out to be good ones, or things that we still think hold to be true, are people that had, of course, good intentions. Here, clearly, there are good intentions here. The idea is clearly to help people in this case and study the economics in order to probably make a better situation. And note that, of course, the father of economics, being Adam Smith, was a moral philosopher. So he before economics was even a science, it was put into place, or put basically on the map, by someone who was a moral philosopher and clearly had the idea of human needs and how to help the most people, or how to be the most efficient, and these types of questions and reasoning in place as he was thinking through that. So chapter goals: we will be able to define economics. We want to discuss ways in which economics use economic reasoning. So there's a couple ways we want to do that. We want to see how economists use economic reasoning, one, in order for us to think about how people behave, so that we might be able to predict more precisely how others will behave. We also may want to have some system of reasoning for ourselves to make the most logical and reasonable decisions. So how can we have a system in which to make a reasonable types of decisions? So we're going to have real-world events in terms of economic forces. Anytime you look at the news, just about anything that happens in the news, there's probably going to be some type of economic factor in there, and it's good to have an idea and be able to look at it through that angle. Not always the only angle, it's the economic angle, but it's one way to look at things when we're taking a look at the news. Social forces: obviously economics is the study of people, and people are social, and we have to consider the idea of how people are going to behave in a social setting. And political forces. So especially macroeconomics is going to be very political. You can't really take away politics and macroeconomics. It's going to be involved in many decision makings on the macro level. So any involvement in any kind of political stuff really need to have some grounding on your economic idea of the world. So what is economics and why learn? So economics is the study of human beings coordinate their wants and desires given the decision-making mechanism, social customs, and political realities of the society. So note what we're doing here. There's a couple things to break down in this. One is that economics is a social science, as we can see from us taking a look at human beings and the way they act. So let's break that down a bit further. What is a science, and what is it to be a social science? And note that before we had sciences, before sciences became sciences, everything was in the realm of philosophy. So it's not like we didn't have science before science was a subfield. Science was basically included in the field of philosophy, and the idea is, when would it get pulled out of philosophy? When did we come up with these subfields? What makes something a science versus philosophy? And the idea, oftentimes, one way of thinking of that might be that it happens when we can predict and measure things with a high degree of accuracy. So when we're able to see cause and effect in a certain realm of things, We believe that we know something standard about the world, and therefore it's very knowable, and therefore we can basically break something out from to a science. Now, that kind of means that the things that are in philosophy still, in some ways, are harder, because we don't have a systematic way to break them down or to think about them. We can't just test the world and see the observation with our senses and determine what a cause and effect will be yet. Maybe at some point in time, we will be able to do that more. Some of the sciences that we first would think about when we're going to think would be something like physics, and that's going to be a hard science, something that we can measure to a high degree of accuracy in many different settings. And the way we do that is we can test things. And of course, when we test things, we bring things into the lab, and we're able to eliminate all of the factors except for one, hopefully. So if it's something like gravity, we can take a rock into the lab, we can eliminate all factors, including air, and drop the rock and see what the cause and effect can be, and thereby measure what's going to happen to a high degree of accuracy through a science. Now, note, when we think about social sciences, you think, well, that could be a little bit more messy right there. If you think about psychology, sociology, and economics, now you've got human factors in there, and now we're going to try to apply this same scientific method of isolating things down, looking at certain factors and seeing if we can predict things about the world, things about, in this case, human behavior in the world as a reaction to different ways worlds are at, and see if we can come up to predictions about the way people are. And that's going to be the social science that we will be taking a look at here in terms of economics. So the three central coordination problems any economic must solve. So here's the kind of conditions that we're looking at oftentimes when we're thinking about economics. What and how much to produce. So first, when we think about economics, we're thinking about the production of goods and the consumption of goods and services. Production of goods and services, consumption of goods and services. So first off, the question is, what are we going to produce, and how much of it are we going to produce it? And who gets to determine those questions? Who gets to determine how much we're going to produce, and who gets to produce it? And of course, we've had different ways to do that in different societies. We've had that done from a centralized area, a top-down area, and we've had ideas that to do that from a more market-driven area, and of course everywhere, and a lot of places in between those two. So we have the question of how are we going to produce different things, and there's going to be different topics that will come up within here. Some of the things that will come up is we could have a way of producing things that are highly intensive in labor and human capital. We could maybe produce things with more machine hours rather than human capital. We have current types of debates over how should we produce things in order to limit things like pollution, air pollution, and whatnot. So how can we make things to be more efficient in that way? So, and then for whom to produce it, basically who gets to consume the goods. And notice there's often a conflict between the idea of consumption, how do we divvy out what we produce, and how much to produce, because in general, as a whole, if we took at the products as a whole, we would often want to produce more and or be more efficient in production, because we want to be able to distribute more. And we often think that in order to produce more, the more efficient way to produce the highest level of goods is market-oriented. However, sometimes we can also see that if we rely on the market for the distribution of things, it could lead to somewhat uneven distributions or unfair distributions, depending on people's definitions. We'll have different definitions, as we'll discuss, of what fair is. And so that is often going to be an issue that will come up. Scarcity. So first thing we're going to talk about scarcity. We're going to talk about some rules. And when we think about economics, we're going to have to think about mental models, and many times we're going to basically make up rules and conditions. And these are going to be assumptions. You'll hear them called assumptions that we're going to make in economics. And notice that an assumption doesn't necessarily hold true in all cases. It's going to be an assumption. It's going to be a model. So note that when we think about science, oftentimes we can eliminate all other factors and see what the cause and effect is on one factor. Like if we took something into the lab and eliminated all other factors. Now, in a social science, we can't do that all the time, because clearly there's going to be factors that we can't just test in a lab fashion. what we can do is we can observe certain things, and we can create mental models to eliminate factors and try to think through how things would happen within a mental model. That means that the mental model, of course, is a simplified version of the world. It's not the world itself, but if the simplified model can tell us something about the world, then it's a good model. For example, we even do this in things like physics gets accused of the same things, to oversimplify complicated problems. For example, if they're trying to figure out how the Earth rotates, then in order to do the math, they might say, well, the Earth is perfectly round, and let's figure it out as if the world is perfectly round. Well, the world's not perfect. I mean, there's mountains on the world and stuff. But, of course, if we just take the simplified version and say, well, I'm not going to account for all the mountains on the world because that would take a lot of math, that would be incredibly difficult. So what if we just make it, the world's like round, and then we'll do the calculation, and then the answer good enough? Does it tell us what we need to know about the world? Is that going to be does that model reflect accurately enough to tell us about the real world that we are looking at? Same thing's going to happen with economics. We're gonna have to simplify certain things. May not hold true across all areas. However, the question, of course, in determining whether a model is good or not, is to say, does it hold true on general? Does it tell us something true about the world? First thing we're going to say is that we have a problem of scarcity in economics. What does that mean? Scarcity exists because individuals want more than can be produced. So idea, we're going to produce stuff in the world, and we're going to distribute that stuff in some kind of way. And our central problem here is that the desires of people as a whole are far greater than the amount of stuff we have to distribute. If we could have more stuff to fulfill everybody's desire, then the idea would be that we wouldn't have a problem. But and notice that may not hold through in all places, because we can't think, well, if we're talking about people, some people have a lot more desires than other people. Some people desire different types of things. But in general, if we think about that's probably an accurate problem in the world if we think about it in these terms. So scarcity means goods available are too few to satisfy the individual desires. So how are we going to fix that, or how can we deal with that? How can we be most efficient in that? Well, there's two factors on that. We can produce more or less stuff, or we can distribute it in some other different fashions. And so the degree of scarcity constantly changes. So clearly there's going to be differences in the amount of production of stuff that we make over time for whatever reasons, this reason or that reason. And there could be differences in people's desires for whatever reason as well. It could change dramatically. So the quantity of goods, services, and usable resources depends on technology and human action. This is an important point that I think is overlooked a lot as well. So, because when we think about resources and we think about distributing resources, oftentimes people start thinking of just, the natural resources. If everybody just, divvied up all the natural resources in the world evenly, then it could be thought that, that would be fair. We could just take all the natural resources in the world and everybody gets an equal share of it. But notice that we have a problem there, and one of the problems is that most of the stuff that we make is in a high degree in terms of human and technological activity. So, I mean, if we think natural resources, we're thinking like water, we're thinking air, but we're also thinking things like oil and stuff like that, and land. And if we think of things like oil, I mean, the oil is in the ground. So if we just divvied it up evenly, of course, it's not any good to anybody unless someone took it out of the ground and then did a lot of work to refine it and then shipped it to people so that it could be used. So notice that there's a high degree of human capital in most of the things we consume, and that's really how we get so much stuff. That's how we're able to consume so many things, is because of specialization, because of trade, and our ability to basically concentrate on one particular thing and not even know, how other things are made or created. And so that's going to be one of the issues we're going to have to determine. How do we maximize the amount of production, and then how do we distribute those? So we have the two categories of economics, being economic theories divided into microeconomics, the study of individual choice and how that choice is influenced by economic forces. So micro meaning, of course, small. So we're talking about individual choices. How do we think about the way individuals make choices? And note there, a lot of people, when I present this, a lot of people will say, well, how can you tell how an individual will make a choice? Individuals are different. Individuals make different choices, which is true, but we are going to make assumptions and think that if we think about, in quotes, a reasonable person making a choice in this situation will generally measure these types of factors, and these types of factors will hold true on average in general. So those are the assumptions we're going to make in our model when determining some of these factors. Macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole. So when we think about the entire economy, the entire GDP and whatnot, then we're thinking about the big picture, the macro picture. So if we break that down a bit more, we're going to say microeconomics studies things like the pricing policy of firms. So when we're talking about individual firms and their pricing policies, we're talking about the firms within the greater macroeconomy and how they're going to make decisions in their microeconomy. And of course, they have different, when you think about that, they have a lot different motivations in the microeconomy than we might have when we think about the macroeconomy. And the microeconomy, of course, is going to be driven by profit and maximizing profit for that firm. The macroeconomy, we're thinking about how to maximize the most efficient production for the entire economy, and those two things are at odds. So households' decisions on what to buy, so when we think about individuals and their purchasing decisions, that's going to be microeconomics. How markets allocate resources among alternative ends. So we have macroeconomic studies things such as inflation. So whenever, again, if you think politics, these are going to come up. I mean, and you really kind of have to have an opinion of some degree on these types of things when you think about politics, because they're so important, especially to, well, basically to any politics, whether it be local or national. And of course, inflation is going to be one of those factors we'll think about. What causes inflation? Inflation has completely devastated some countries, and it could devastate households, and so we have to keep that in mind. Unemployment, so that's clearly another issue that will be brought up all the time. How can we lower the overall unemployment? What are the types of things that will increase or decrease unemployment in the economy? And economic growth in general. So how can we measure economic growth? What is economic growth, and what does that mean to people?